Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 765 of People Behind the Science. We are excited to be rebroadcasting our interview today with Dr. John Aitchison. It was originally released on May 14th of 2018. Listeners, John's research investigates the systems biology related to infectious disease by using technology, computation, and high-throughput biology to examine molecules in complex biological systems in order to better understand how the system will react to a new stimulus or perturbation. This work is critical for ultimately being able to predict how effective a drug or vaccine will be against a particular disease, and also to implement treatments with high efficiency. And in our interview, John talks more about his life, his career, and his research. So I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am excited to introduce you all today to our guest scientist, Dr. John Aitchison. So, John, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to chat with you today and delighted to have you on our show. But before we go into the details, I want to take a moment to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, John is president and director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research, which is the largest independent nonprofit organization in the United States that is focused solely on infectious disease research. In addition, John serves as an affiliate or adjunct professor at the University of Washington, the University of British Columbia, the University of Alberta, and also the Institute for Systems Biology. John received his bachelor's degree with honors in biochemistry from McMaster University and his PhD in biochemistry from McMaster University as well. He then conducted postdoctoral research in the Laboratory of Cell Biology at the Rockefeller University. Next, John served on the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta, and afterwards he became a founding member at the Institute for Systems Biology, where he later served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of Integrative Biology. While working there at the Institute for Systems Biology, John also began conducting research at the Center for Infectious Disease Research, where he still works today. And in our interview today, John is going to talk more about his life and his science. So John, we're excited to learn more about both the scientific side as well as your life outside of science. So can you start by talking about the latter and what you like to do when you're not hard at work?
Well, I think that my most exciting passion outside of science is sailing. I do a lot of sailboat racing.
Very cool. So how did you get into sailing?
When I was a kid, my parents began sailing, and as a kid, I go to summer camp, and summer camp was a sailing camp, and I began racing sailboats then, and I just loved it. I love racing. I love being on the water. I've done it my entire life since the age of 7 or 8, and do whatever I can to get back out on that water anytime I can.
Phenomenal. Well, sailing sounds like an exciting hobby. I've done it a couple times myself. My aunt and uncle are into sailing.
This is part of the reason I live in Seattle.
Oh, yeah. I grew up on Lake Erie, so.
And Lake Erie will do it.
Yeah.
But wherever I live, I have to be fairly close to the water so that I can get out on it.
That's awesome. So are there any other hobbies or things that you like to do in your spare time?
Well, mostly sports. I play squash. I ski. I spend a lot of time with my family, which is my daughter and my son are now grown adults. I love to spend time with them and, of course, with my wife. So we're sort of an outdoorsy, sporty kind of existence.
I like it. Well, John, great to see a little bit more about how you spend your time when you're not working. But I do want to talk about work next, and I imagine you have a lot going on at work. So how do you describe it to someone who's not familiar with where you work or what you do?
Well, there's about 14 million people that die from infectious diseases each year, mostly from diseases like malaria, HIV, and TB. And these really affect the populations in the developing world, most dramatically, of course. And there are no drugs or good vaccines against them. And the question we have to ask ourselves is why not? We have vaccines against smallpox, polio, and measles, and so on. But diseases like malaria, HIV, and TB have really persisted despite our attempts with vaccines. And I think the answer to it is complexity. These bugs are smart. They've developed ways to avoid our immune systems, and we need to be smarter than them, and we need to understand our immune systems and understand how these bugs have figured out how to avoid and control us. And I think the answer to that lies in technology and computation and high-throughput biology, and this is what I call systems biology. And in that, we want to be able to interrogate the molecular players in these large, complex systems like the human body and understand how these bugs go about their business. So we use high-throughput biology, which we call omics, to interrogate as many molecules as we can, to understand the dialogue between these molecules. And then we use computation and math in hopes of being able to predict how the system will react to a new change or a new perturbation. The hope is that we can make biology predictive, like we understand the rules of physics and chemistry, so physics and chemistry are predictive. If we can make biology a predictive science, I think we'll be able to make a huge impact across virtually every disease. And in particular, in the diseases we're working on, be able to predict how effective a drug or a vaccine will be and be able to implement it with a high efficiency. That's our goal. And that's what we try to do here at the Center for Infectious Disease Research.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to chatting more about your work and about the Center for Infectious Disease Research throughout our conversation today. But I do want to pause here to talk a little bit about motivation. We mentioned some of the things that you like to do in life and now some of the things that you're doing at work, and it can be hard to juggle everything. So I'm always on the lookout for pieces of motivation and inspiration that I can incorporate into my own lives and help our listeners with as well. So do you have a particular quote or a saying or a force that really keeps you going?
I have a bunch of different quotes on my wall. Mm-hmm. I've collected them through the years, and they're tacked up in old pieces of paper. So I read them often, and they range from very erudite quotes to very simple quotes, like from the drive-by truckers, the secret to a happy ending is to know when to roll the credits, or from Benjamin Franklin, any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do. But I think that there are two quotes that I look at most often. One is from Günter Blobel, who was my mentor and won the Nobel Prize in 1999 in physiology and medicine. And it's a very simple one. He said, "I thought my ideas were reasonable, so why not propose them?" So I think often in science we are a little bit too afraid to extend ourselves a little bit and to go out on that limb. But Günter, he always did, and he was never afraid to say something that he thought was right. And as he would say, let 1,000 flowers bloom or 100 flowers bloom and see what happens. And the other quote that I think that I sort of live my life by is, so long as there's a little bit of laugh going, things are all right. As soon as this infernal seriousness, like a greasy sea, heaves up, everything is lost. And that's by D.H. Lawrence. And I really try to keep humor into most everything I do, even when things are very serious.
Absolutely. I think laughter gets you through some of the tough times in science, too.
That's for sure.
Well, I love that you have this quote wall that you can turn to for a little bit of motivation or inspiration when you need it. But I want to hear a little bit next, John, about some of the people who might have motivated you or inspired you over the course of your career. So do any individuals come to mind as role models or mentors or people that you've looked up to?
Well, I've been fortunate to be around some of the most inspirational people. It's hard for me to think of one or two people that inspired me the most and were my true role models, but I think there are probably two, and these are both mentors of mine, very similar in many ways. This is Rick Ratchabinsky, who was my PhD supervisor, who got me into science in the first place, and Günter Blobel, who was my postdoctoral supervisor at Rockefeller University. Günter sadly passed away this past week, and I've been thinking a lot about him. I think what's similar between Günter and Rick is they're both incredibly passionate about science, but also passionate about life. And I really admire that about both of them. But when I think about Günter, he had an incredible joie de vivre. He saw beauty around him in virtually everything. He appreciated beauty in cities and gardens and very much in people. He was just an amazing guy. And he and Rick really have been great role models for me.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you did a really exceptional job choosing or finding these mentors. Do you have any advice for our listeners out there who might be trying to figure out who they want to work with for their PhD or for even undergraduate programs?
Passion. When I joined Rick Ratchabinsky's lab, he was a junior professor. And people often think that they need to go to a more senior person, someone who's more established. But I think that you can learn so much from somebody who's committed and passionate about the work that they're doing. And that's what I got out of my time with Rick Rachebinski. And Rick gave me very, very solid advice all through my career. He was the one who recommended that I go to Günter Blobel. At the time, I thought Günter was iconic. It was before he won his prize, but I had been reading about him as an undergrad and graduate student, and I was intimidated by this idea of going to Rockefeller University from Toronto to New York. I'd never been to New York. From a small lab at McMaster University to an iconic lab at Rockefeller University. That was incredibly intimidating. But I have to tell you, Rick said, hey, give it a shot. Mm-hmm. I said, Rick, I'll do that if you make the introduction. And he called Günter. And Günter, that afternoon, it was a Tuesday, was in the lab. One of the people in the lab picked it up, called me over to the phone. I got to the phone and, John, this is Günter.
Oh, wow.
Like, oh, my goodness.
You have to sit down for that one.
And he said, so you will be here on Friday and give a talk?
Oh, wow.
I said,
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
He said, I'll see you at noon. Bye-bye. And that was it.
That is amazing.
It was a very intimidating experience, but it taught me a lot, too. Those are the days where you had to put slides together by taking photographs, mounting them, taking a second photograph, and then converting them to slides. It was a lot of fun. Ended up at Rockefeller on Friday by noon, gave my talk, was home Friday night, and that was it.
That is phenomenal. Well, I love hearing these stories about the beginnings of scientists' careers. And I'm curious if we rewind even farther back in your own career, John, is there a particular memory or a moment where you first started getting excited about science that you can tell us about?
Sure. When I was an undergrad, I wasn't very interested actually in biochemistry or reading through Lubert Stryer or learning about metabolic pathways. It seemed all very dry to me. And I took an honors thesis class, and we had to go into a lab and do research for a few months. And I went into Rachebinski's lab. I don't know why I went into Rachebinski's lab. I can't tell you that. I don't know why. But anyway, I ended up in Rachebinski's lab. And I remember looking at an autoradiogram and interpreting the autoradiogram and thinking, my God, I'm the only one in the history of the world that has ever known this fact. And that struck me like, this is amazing. What a privilege it is to be able to do science. What a privilege it is to be able to work in these areas that are so important to humanity and understand the significance of the work that we do. Even that little autoradiogram as an undergraduate student, but nonetheless, I was the only one at the time that ever knew that information. I think that's amazing. And that's how I started in science. From that day forward, that excitement, that little jitter you get from making a discovery, even as insignificant as that little one was, I still thrive on that.
Definitely. I think it's so easy to fall in love with these small moments of discovery, especially in the early years when, right, you have that realization where I am the only one in the world who knows this or who has seen this. So can you tell us a little bit? You mentioned kind of how you went about going through your undergraduate and your PhD years, and then, of course, doing this postdoctoral fellowship with the amazing Günter Blobel. What then prompted you into your next career path steps? We mentioned that next you ended up at the University of Alberta. How did that come about?
Well, I wanted to go back to Canada. Mm-hmm. Canada had given me my education. It paid for my postdoctoral fellowship. I loved Canada, and I felt an obligation to go back to Canada. And at the time, University of Alberta was building a very exciting cell biology department, and that's where I wanted to go. And it turns out that the chair of the department was, again, enters back into my life, Rick Rachebinski.
Oh, wow.
I think science actually is much more about personal relationships than we like to admit. But anyway, Rick recruited me back to the University of Alberta, and I was happy to do that. I was very excited.
Absolutely. And then you later went on to become a founding member of the Institute for Systems Biology. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became involved with this institute and what your role was like there?
Again, relationships. Alan Adaram was someone I knew at Rockefeller University. He and I had spent a lot of time with our children in strollers, walking around Central Park and going to early Starbucks, just trying to get out of our small apartments. Alan was a professor at Rockefeller at the time, and if it weren't for our children being good friends, we probably wouldn't have spent much time together because we were in different circles. But Alan and I spent a lot of time talking about science on those walks, talking about our philosophies of science. And he ended up moving to the University of Washington. And I was going to start this Institute with Systems Biology with Lee Hood and Rudy Aebersold. And I was invited down to the University of Washington to give a talk. And it had some high throughput biology in it and talked about some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of integration of computation and so on. And Lee Hood and Alan came to me and asked me if I wanted to join their institute that they were starting. Hadn't started yet, but it was in its initial stages. And I thought, yeah, that sounds really tremendously exciting. At the time, it was going to be part of the University of Washington. But by the time I got down to ISB, it was going to be independent of the university. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, back to Rick Ratchabinsky, I went back to the University of Alberta, talked to Rick. Rick had been my mentor, as I've already said, as a PhD student. And he spent a lot of effort recruiting me to Alberta, a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And I'd only been there just over 2 years. And I said to Rick, I described the situation, I described the opportunity. At the time, I didn't know what systems biology really was. I knew what I was trying to do. I didn't have a name for it. But I sat with Rick and I told him what this was about, to work with Lee Hood, to work with Alan Durham and Rudy Aebersold, and we were going to start this institute, and it was going to be about integrating technologies and high-throughput biology and computation and mathematics. And Rick just looked at me and he said, John, if you don't take this opportunity, I will lose a tremendous amount of respect for you as a scientist and a person.
Wow.
And I said, well, my fate is sealed.
That answers that. Oh, wow.
I mentioned earlier that Rick has given me great advice through my career and has really been a fantastic mentor. And that was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever obtained. It's really about seizing those opportunities that you have in front of you, recognizing them and being prepared for them and seizing them, even though they can be scary at the time.
Definitely. Well, I love this idea that you brought up of the network and the connections and how they played a pretty big part in your own career path. And I'm curious to hear about how you then became a leader at the Center for Infectious Disease Research. So can you tell us a little bit about how this opportunity came about?
Well, that evolved from working at ISB for 10 plus years, seeing the opportunities that systems biology can provide to any molecular biological sort of interrogation. And again, spending a lot of time with Alan, talking to him about the impact of infectious diseases, especially in the developing world. And I came to the realization that I really wanted to try and develop systems biology in the context of infectious diseases, in hopes that, as I've said earlier, to be able to really make impact in some of these most devastating diseases. So the Center for Infectious Disease Research, which at the time was called Seattle Biomedical Research Institute, or Seattle Biomed, it had been started by Ken Stewart in 1977 or so as an independent research institute. And Ken is an amazing guy, too, I should say. He started this whole institute basically on one R01.
Oh, wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, really amazing. And it was Ken's passion for developing world diseases that really began this whole global health program here at Seattle Biomed, or now Center for Infectious Disease Research. So I got to know Ken. Alan and I were good friends. The scientific advisory board for Seattle Biomed at the time made the recommendation of expanding into systems biology because systems biology by this time had begun to garner a little bit more favor. Its successes were a little bit more evident. The promise was clear. So Alan approached me with this opportunity to come to CIDR. Alan and I came over at the same time from ISB to CIDR for the express purpose of applying systems biology to infectious disease areas. Our relationship with ISB and systems biology was really very important to me. I retained an appointment at ISB, and for almost probably close to 5 years, my lab was split between ISB and the Center for Infectious Disease Research. I had 50% of my lab at one spot and 50% at the other. And I would walk back and forth across the 2 blocks or block and a half daily, trying to keep my lab going in both places. Mm-hmm. Then at some point, it was time for a leadership change at CIDR. Alan stepped down as the president, and the opportunity presented itself for me. And I made an application. They did a search, as they do, and turns out that I ended up with a job.
Well, congratulations.
Well, the one thing about it is it's a tough new balance, that's for sure. Balancing my life outside of work, my family, my outside activities with science, which I'm still very passionate about, and leadership of the organization, which falls to more administrative responsibilities and decision-making and that sort of thing. So it used to be primarily 2 things, science and life outside of the lab. Now there's 3. So it's a tough balance.
Absolutely. You're just increasing those juggling skills over the years, right?
Yeah, but my left hand doesn't work as well as it used to.
Right. Me neither.
I'm very right hand dominant.
Fantastic. Well, great to hear a little bit about how your career progressed and how you got to this position where you are today. And I know you have some phenomenal work going on in that research laboratory of yours. So I'd love to hear more about a particular project. Is there a favorite one that you're just really excited to be working on right now?
There's so many things. So as the president and director here, I take a broader view of the science that's ongoing here than I would have typically taken a few years ago. It's just my lab. I am incredibly excited about all of the applications of systems biology to infectious disease. I have to tell you, we're doing things from interrogating the efficacy of vaccines and trying to make predictions about how effective a vaccine will be by reading molecular fingerprints in blood. We are trying to determine, using machine learning, computational approaches, trying to predict what it is that makes malaria more severe in some cases than in others by interrogating both the clinical symptoms, the clinical signs, as well as the molecular determinants in the parasites. At the Institute, we've got a new genetically attenuated vaccine that just went into clinical trials this past week. There are a bunch of Seattleites walking around Seattle that have all been infected with malaria right now.
Oh, wow.
There's so much exciting research going on, and CIDR really has a storied history in molecular parasitology and pathogenesis. And now the integration of systems biology has just opened up so many new opportunities that I'm very excited about. A lot of the things I've told you about are very translational or more on the clinical side. But I still get very passionate about the basic systems cell biology, I'll call it, that we do in the lab, and very, very passionate about all of that. I was just watching a video of Gunter earlier today, and in that video he said there are 1,001 different cancers. And if you work on the basic cell biology, you work on all of these diseases at the same time. Because at some point, you have to understand what the molecular dialogues are. And that's really foundational to the way I think. We really need to understand the molecular players, the molecular interactions, and what it is that causes these diseases. So I like to go all the way from the very basic science all the way up to the more translational opportunities.
Absolutely. And I think it's wonderful that you're able to incorporate both basic research and a lot of these important translational or application components into the work that's being done there at the center. But I'm curious to hear about some of the challenges. I think so far we've talked about a lot of the great things that happened in your career, the sort of serendipitous people who helped you connect from one thing to another. And I know it's not all roses and wonderful things that happen in the career of a scientist.
It's not.
So, John, I'm going to ask you to tell us about some of the tough times next, whether it's challenges that you've encountered or failures that you've had, or just moments of stress and struggle. So do you have one of these kinds of memories you can share with us today?
Well, moments of stress and struggle are almost daily.
Yeah.
But there was one particularly difficult time for me, and I was actually thinking about giving up science, and that was when I started my postdoc. I started on a project that my supervisor, Gunter, really had an instinct about. He really wanted me to demonstrate something, and he wanted me to go about that using all the tools we had in the lab. It was a pet hypothesis that he really had a strong feeling about, and every experiment I did pointed in a different direction.
Oh, no.
And Gunter was iconic and great instincts, and he was probably going to win the Nobel Prize. And I felt badly because whatever I did, I couldn't support his hypothesis. And that was very frustrating. So every interaction I had with him was a disappointing interaction in the first couple of years. And I thought, maybe I'm just not that good. Maybe this isn't for me. So one day I mustered up the courage and I went into Gunter's office, tried to lay out the argument for why this wasn't working. And Gunter said to me, "I'm so disappointed."
Right.
He said, "John, I understand what you're saying, but this is really important." And he went on for a bit and I felt badly. And the next morning, so he would walk down the lab benches, and if he tapped on the end of your bench, you look up and he'd say, "Let's talk." So he tapped on the end of my bench that morning, and I walked into his office, and he said, "John, the smartest thing you ever did was give up on that project."
Oh, wow. Complete 180 there.
But he thought about it, and he realized that perhaps his hypothesis was not correct, and he really cared a lot about people. And I think in our conversation, he realized how much I was struggling with this. And in the end, he agreed very nice about the whole thing. Anyway, I started a different project and began collaborating with others in the lab, and it went very well from there on.
Absolutely. So I have to ask, during this low point, you mentioned you had this thought of potentially giving up science. Did you have a backup plan in place or an alternative in mind when you were having these thoughts?
Well, at the time, I was sailing with a guy up in Connecticut who was part of a law firm. And he said, if you really want to give up science, maybe there's room for you in intellectual property or IP law. And so I thought about that. And I went to a law firm, his law firm, and I saw this guy in a small room. And he had a PhD from Harvard, gave up on his postdoc, just like I was thinking about. And he had a pile of papers on one side of his desk and a smaller pile on the other side. And the pile on his left side was probably a foot high. And the pile on his right side was probably, half that height.
Oh, geez.
And he was reading through these pages and moving them from one stack to the other. And I thought, man, that's not for me.
Right.
And I never looked back.
Motivate you to go right back into the lab, right?
Exactly.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, John, for telling us about these tough times and how you worked your way through them. But we don't just want to focus on your difficult moments in science. I'd love to hear about one of your success stories next.
Well, back in my postdoc days, after I gave up on an initial project, started on some others, and made a discovery about proteins that move different proteins in and out of the nucleus. We called them caryophorins at the time. Other people call them importans and exportins since then, or transportins. But yeah, we discovered a family of these transport factors that I was very excited about at the time. And I remember going back to my little apartment, standing in the kitchen, thinking about this project. Those were great times because we never gave up on thinking about this stuff because it was so exciting, so much fun, and it was a real challenge. Again, putting ourselves out there a little bit, trying to follow Gunter's advice. If I thought my ideas were reasonable, why not propose them? I was a little nervous about whether we were right or wrong. There's a lot of competition in the field. Others were proposing other roles other than what we were proposing. It was a very exciting time. Turns out we were right, and the rest is history.
So how did you celebrate this exciting success?
I don't know.
You still haven't yet. Put that on your to-do list.
It might be right. Well, I'll tell you. So about that summer, 96 or so, there was a conference in Italy, and I went to that conference as a postdoc. It was a conference that was specifically designed for principal investigators, but Gunter asked me to go. I went, presented that work. And I guess that was a celebration of that because these were all the bigwigs in the field. And I was pretty nervous about that, a little anxious about whether we were right or wrong. And then after the conference, it was in a beautiful place called Lago di Garda in northern Italy. It was the first time I'd been to continental Europe. It was a great experience. And then my wife flew in and I met her in Venice. It was a great trip. So I guess that was a celebration.
Well, that's a wonderful way to celebrate, I must say. And great to hear about this project. And I think when you're in these projects, whether it's one that ultimately ends in failure or success, I think it can help when you're kind of hitting your head against the wall or at a roadblock to step away from a project. And one of the things I love to do when I'm stepping away from something is to refresh my mind, maybe pick up a good book. So do you have a book recommendation that you can recommend for me or our listeners if we need to escape for a little bit?
I'm not sure this is a book that is sort of light and airy and refreshes your mind, but this is a book that was sitting on my bookshelf for years. It was given to me by a postdoctoral scientist in my lab, Jennifer Smith, who thought it would be great if I read it. And it sat on my shelf for years, and I picked it up not too long ago and read it and thought it was fantastic. It was Endurance, a story of Ernest Shackleton and their voyage to the Antarctic. It was just an incredible story. This polar expedition ended up stuck in the ice for about 10 months in 1914, 1915. 27 men. After about 10 months in the ice, their ship was crushed. They spent a couple months on an ice floe. And then after 2 months on the ice floe, that ice floe broke up to a point where they couldn't really survive on that floe for any longer. And they took to 3 lifeboats. Just an amazing story about perseverance. Truly amazing how the elements, nature, are so unforgiving, and yet how the human spirit and teamwork, for the most part, overcame the tremendous odds. So I would recommend folks who like human spirit stories and stories of leadership and perseverance to pick that one up. And I like stories that are really based in historical fact.
Absolutely. Well, excellent recommendation. I think it ties in nicely too, perhaps to your love of adventure and sailing in boats and such. So,
well, I'll say I do have that affinity.
Not quite ready to go on that level of adventure, right?
Oh, no, I read about it and say it's good for them.
Right.
Not for me.
Well, we mentioned some of the opportunities you've had to travel, and particularly you called out this Lago di Garda trip to a conference in Italy. And I think travel is a huge part of the life of a scientist and one of the wonderful aspects of the career because you get to see so many places and meet so many people. So do you have a favorite place, John, that science has taken you?
I would say Italy. That trip stuck with me. And since my wife and I and our family have been back a couple of times, I think Italy is just an amazing, beautiful country. I love their lifestyle. I love the food. I love the weather. I love the history. So I would say Italy. And that stems from that initial conference, Lago di Garda, in 1996.
Phenomenal. So what are some of your favorite things to do or see when you're in Italy?
Well, I was standing on the road in front of my house, and I was thinking about what my favorite place in the world is, where I felt most comfortable. And I think Portofino in Cinque Terre, which is on the Mediterranean in Italy. I just love that spot. Small village, boats, Portofino.
Well, it sounds wonderful. You've got me and our listeners already wanting to book our next trip to Italy.
Check it out.
Right? Phenomenal. Well, thanks so much for sharing some of your own experiences and talking about the travel aspects of science. But I do also want to talk about the people aspect of science. And we've sort of hinted at this a couple times in our conversation, but the people you get to work with are phenomenal and oftentimes very contrary to the stereotypes that many people have about scientists. You meet people who are funny, amazing, inspiring. And I love sharing these human sides of science because I think not many people get to see them. So, John, do you have any funny memories or quirky traditions or fun stories that you've shared with scientists that you can tell us today?
Well, we have a fun tradition in the lab, and then that is at Christmas time. The lab has had between 8 and 15 people or so, and everyone draws a name out of a hat, or they're assigned by one of the people in the lab, and we go to a restaurant, and each individual reads a poem that they've created about the person they pulled out of the hat. And that's a great tradition because the poems are always funny. You get a really great sense of the creativity of some of the folks. You see another side of people, some people who you'd never think will start singing and convert their poems into a rap song.
Oh, wow.
The only rule we have about that is that they have to be nice.
That's a good rule to have. Yeah.
You just can't be mean. And with these poems, you really see what people think of each other, and they're always generous, and they're always warm, and they really, I think, help to bring the lab together. I'd like to do that on a larger scale, but I think it's impossible. But I do really enjoy that lab tradition that we've started about 5 years ago.
Well, I love this tradition, and I've not heard one like it, so this is really cool.
No, I think I made it up, but I might be wrong.
Well, you're going to have some people now stealing your tradition once they hear about it on our show. So, John, are you a poet outside of these special events?
No, I'm not very creative.
Gotcha. Do you have a particular style that you lean towards, maybe a limerick or a haiku?
Dr. Seuss is always a good standby.
I like it. Well, this is a phenomenal tradition and a great way to really showcase and emphasize some of the great traits of the people that you work with in the lab every day. And I think we've talked about some of the big questions that you guys are answering there in the laboratory. And I think it's so important to tackle some of these big questions. And the Center for Infectious Disease Research is doing a great job of it. But I think there's always constraints. There's always things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility and time that are holding you back. So, John, if I took away all the restrictions, all the barriers, what is the one question or the one problem you would want to tackle?
Well, I'm doing it. The one thing I'm trying to answer, and this is the great strength of having an institute that's focused on a relatively narrow problem and doing so in a collaboration. I want to understand how the immune system reacts and is impacted by infectious diseases. I'd like to be able to bring a little bit more equity to the world, to bring some of these places out of poverty. And so I think I'm doing it. Systems biology and infectious diseases. That's what I want to do. And understand how the immune system really reacts and how we can control it. The immune system, inflammation, lies at the heart of virtually every disease that's important to us, even neurodegeneration, arthritis, cancer. We've got great examples of harnessing the immune system to fight cancers. If you think about these infectious diseases, things like when you and I were kids and we'd see an inchworm crawling across a table or across the grass, and you'd poke it, and you'd poke it to see how the inchworm reacts. Well, that's the nature of science, isn't it? We do everything we do in science. We try to perturb it and try to understand how the system reacts to the perturbation. And with these infectious agents, these are the perturbants. And we're trying to understand how these things that have, in some cases, co-evolved with humanity for millennia have developed exquisite mechanisms to control the immune system so that they can survive. They don't want to kill us. They want to exploit us. Sometimes we die, but for the most part, we promote the survival of these viruses and pathogens. So I think it's an amazing problem, and it has important humanitarian and economic impact. So I think the answer is I'm doing what I want to do.
I love it. Well, I'm so happy to hear that you're able to work on these big questions that you're just the most passionate about. And I think that's one of the things that really kind of motivates people to go in every day when they're able to find that thing that they love and make a job of it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So we mentioned some advice that you've received over the course of your career from these inspirational mentors and these wonderful people you've encountered. So John, is there one piece of advice that you really want to pass on to our listeners today to help them on their own careers?
It's a competitive world, and science is more competitive than I think it was when I was starting out. And I think the key is to enjoy what you're doing. If you're passionate about something, you can take those hits that we're all inevitably going to take. But if you enjoy what you're doing and you embrace it and pursue it with passion, I think you can get a lot of joy out of this research as a career. So enjoy what you're doing.
Excellent advice, John. Is there any other last message you want to leave all of our listeners out there with today?
Folks out there, enjoy it. Life's short. Do what you're doing and pursue it with passion.
Wonderful. What a great note to end on. John, can you tell our listeners if they want to learn more about you and the wonderful work that you're doing, where should they go?
CIDresearch.org is our website. I'm always happy to receive an email if somebody really wants to contact me directly. John.Aitchison, AITCHISON @CIDresearch.org. I'm happy to talk to you.
Wonderful. Well, listeners, definitely check out the website. So many amazing projects they've got going on there, and get in touch with John if you have any specific questions. And John, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us on the show.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
It has been such a pleasure to chat with you, and wonderful to have you here as well, listeners. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.